So there are moments in life that unsettle us, when the ground beneath our feet shifts, when the things we counted on no longer feel steady. At first, we may not even notice. Change often begins quietly, like a shift in the wind, like the first cracks in the ice on a pond. But then something happens, a loss, a disruption, a tipping point of some kind. And suddenly we realize that what we thought was solid has shifted, exposing a truth that has been hidden, a reality that we hadn't wanted to see. This is the kind of moment we find ourselves in this morning, and it is the kind of moment Isaiah found himself in long ago. In the first reading we heard this morning, we encountered the prophet Isaiah in the year King Uzziah died. This was a time of great uncertainty. King Uzziah's reign had been long and prosperous, an era of military strength, national pride, and economic success. For many, his leadership was a source of stability, a reassurance that their nation was strong. But beneath the surface, inequalities grew. The poor became more vulnerable, while leaders prioritized their own power over justice. The ancient rituals of faith continued, but the prophets warned that worship was hollow when the most vulnerable amongst us were neglected. The people of God were adrift, prosperous perhaps, but divided, uncertain, and increasingly disconnected from the heart of God. We do not know much about Isaiah's life before this moment, but we do know that he was likely a statesman, a person of deep religious devotion. And on this day, in this story, he enters the temple seeking refuge in the familiar rhythms of worship, hoping perhaps for a sense of grounding in uncertain times. But that morning, he encounters something else. The temple fills with smoke, the very foundations of it tremble, and above him seraphims cry out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." Faced with such holiness, Isaiah does not feel emboldened, he feels exposed. "Woe is me, I am lost," he cries, overwhelmed by the truth of who he is and the world he inhabits. But God does not leave him in that place of fear. A seraph approaches carrying a burning coal, not to destroy him, but to refine. It touches Isaiah's lips not with judgment, but with the mark of transformation. And when the voice of the Lord calls, "Whom shall I send?" Isaiah, who moments before felt unworthy, finds himself answering, "Here am I, send me." Centuries later, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, another man experiences a moment that alters everything. Simon Peter is not in a temple. He is not a statesman or a religious leader. He is a fisherman, sitting in his boat, exhausted. He and his crew have labored through the night, casting their nets again and again and again, only to haul in emptiness. No fish, only the weight of their toil, the weariness of their effort without reward, and the quiet resignation of another day of scarcity. Then, without warning, Jesus steps into Peter's boat. Now, it's an unusual move because rabbis do not typically commandeer fishing vessels, but something about Jesus intrigues Peter, and he listens as Jesus teaches from his boat, his words drifting across the water to the waiting crowds that have gathered. And then Jesus turns to Peter and he asks for something more. "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch," Jesus says. At first, Peter hesitates. He knows this sea. He knows the limits of what is possible. "Master, we have worked all night and caught nothing," he says. And yet something about Jesus, his presence, his authority, the quiet insistence of his voice compels Peter to try once more. And then the impossible happens. The nets strain under the weight of the fish. The boats began to sink under the sheer abundance. And in that moment, Peter's world cracks open. He falls to his knees, overcome with guilt and shame. "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man," he cries out. Peter so desperately wants to say yes, but he sees his own limitations, his smallness, his unworthiness, the deep divide between who he is and who he longs to be. But Jesus does not deal in shame. He only sees possibility. "Do not be afraid," Jesus tells him. "From now on, you will be catching people." And with those words, Peter leaves everything behind and follows. Still uncertain, still imperfect, still very much himself, Peter says yes to this call. But what exactly is it that he is saying yes to? What does it mean to be a catcher of people? Like Isaiah before him, Peter's calling is not for his sake alone. God calls them to something bigger, to proclaim justice, to stand with the outcast, to uplift the poor, to call people back to God's vision of love and righteousness. Isaiah dared to speak hard truths to leaders who had turned their backs on the vulnerable. Peter walked alongside Jesus, bringing good news to those who had forgotten, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, reminding people that they were seen, known, and beloved. Their calling was never about personal fulfillment. It was always about transformation, the kind that ripples outward, reshaping the whole world. Neither of them were prepared. Neither of them felt ready for this work, because the call of God is not about readiness, it's about willingness. That call comes to us, not when we feel prepared, but in the middle of our ordinary, messy lives, in the places where we labor, in the spaces where we wrestle with doubt, exhaustion, and the quiet voice that whispers, "Surely someone else is more qualified than me." It is easy to believe that the work of change belongs to someone else, someone wiser, more eloquent, more powerful. It is tempting to think that our role is simply to endure, to wait, to stay quiet and let history unfold around us. But the call of God does not summon us to passivity. It calls us to participation. Isaiah could have remained silent. Peter could have stayed in his boat, but they stepped forward and they said yes, and so must we. Because the times they lived in, times of uncertainty, of transition, of injustice, are not so different from our own. Isaiah stood at the threshold of a nation unraveling, its leaders clinging to the remnants of past glory while the cracks of inequality deepened. Peter lived under the Roman rule where empire pressed its weight onto the backs of the ordinary. And now here we are, in an era where old structures are faltering, where fear and division threaten to take root, where the world aches for something more just, more whole, more loving. If we are truly listening for God's call, we cannot look away. We must be willing to see, to look unflinchingly at what is broken, not in despair, not in resignation, but with the unshakable conviction that God's justice is still unfolding, that transformation is still possible, and that we are being called to be part of it. Here in the United States, we are living in a time where people's dignity and very humanity are under attack, when laws are being written to erase, exclude, and punish, when trans people are told they do not belong, when immigrants and refugees are treated as threats rather than as bearers of God's image, when Black and Indigenous lives are still met with violence, when the poor are blamed for their suffering, when disabled people are denied basic rights, when LGBTQ plus people are demonized rather than embraced. And so let us look and let us be clear. All people are beloved, holy, and sacred. Gay people are beloved, trans people are beloved, refugees are beloved, disabled people are beloved, poor people are beloved, Black and Indigenous people are beloved, immigrants are beloved. You are beloved. I am beloved. And not because I say so, not because the world says so, but because God says so. When Jesus called his disciples, he did not send them to uphold an empire. He sent them to proclaim a kingdom where the last are first, where the oppressed are set free, where every person is known and loved as a child of God. That is the work we are called to, not just resisting the forces of injustice, but building something better, something holy, something new. Each of us has a unique gift. Each of us is called by God to play our part. Some are called to raise their voices, to speak truth in places where truth is obscured, to stand against systems that harm, to demand justice where there is none. But others are called into quiet acts of care, feeding the hungry, welcoming the stranger, offering kindness in a world too often marked by indifference. Some are called to bridge divides, to cultivate the kind of listening that heals rather than harms. Others are called to prayer and formation, grounding themselves in their communities in a hope that does not waver. And for all of us, there is the daily work of love, the choice to be kind when the world is unkind, to believe in redemption when cynicism is easier, to see Christ in the faces of those we might otherwise overlook. None of us can do everything, but each of us can do something. And when we do, when we speak up, when we care for one another, when we refuse to let fear or apathy win, we are already living as citizens of God's kingdom. We are already answering the call. God does not call us because we are ready. God calls us because the world is aching, because justice cannot wait, because love must take root here and now. Isaiah stood before God, his lips burning with the fire of calling, and he said, "Here am I, send me." Peter, weary from fruitless labor, cast his nets once more and found abundance beyond measure. Neither was ready. Both were called, and so are we. We must trust that when we step forward in faith, we will find that same abundance not to overwhelm us, but to sustain us. That we will be transformed by that same fire that refines and discover within ourselves a strength that we did not know we had and receive the grace that makes this work possible. And so when God calls, may we have the courage to say yes. May we dare to see the world as it is and labor for the world as it should be. May we name what is broken and build what is holy. May we resist what harms and shelter what is sacred. This is the work of the kingdom, the work of justice and healing, of tearing down what oppresses and raising up what restores. It is the work of creating a refuge in the storm, of becoming a people among whom love is made known. And as we go, may we be sustained by grace, strengthened by courage, and upheld by the Spirit who is already at work amongst us. Here we are, Lord. Send us. Amen.